And now we're going to go ahead and introduce our presenters. Today's webinar will be presented by Rich Lilly and Nikfar Khalili. Rich is a partner at Netrix. Welcome, Rich. And Nikfar is Vice President of Product for Blue Cedar. Welcome, Nikfar. Now I'll just go ahead and turn the time over to Nikfar to get started.
Great. Thanks, Alicia. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join today's webinar. So here is our agenda for today. Just to give you a quick idea of what we're going through. First, a quick touch on mobile devices and what's preventing organizations from realizing their full potential. Next, we will talk about Microsoft Intune and app management, and that's a good segue into showing how manually integrating app security SDKs isn't a long-term strategy for organizations. Next, we will talk about how automation can help, followed by some applicable use cases, and then we'll close it out with some next steps. So, mobile devices offer some tremendous benefits to organizations, and of course, it's very beneficial to the workers who rely on them, but really it's enterprises who can realize the most benefits. So for example, employees who are using mobile devices for work-related tasks save about 58 minutes daily, and they're also more productive, 34%. These are some Gartner stats. So now that's a big boon for employers who, in effect, are getting more out of their employees. You know, what's not to like about that? And with BYOD, bring your own device, that translates into a monetary savings as well. Companies that support BYOD initiatives, which is where employees use their own personal devices for work purposes, save about $350 per year per employee. That's nothing to be sneezed at. However, organizations aren't fully realizing BYOD's full potential. There are many reasons for this. So organizations that have relied on MDM profiles to control enterprise data on personal devices such as BYOD. Now, MDM profiles give the issuing company complete control over a mobile device. And that doesn't necessarily sit well with very privacy-conscious mobile workers. So my favorite example is, why would you give your employer the ability to delete all your personal photos, which is what happens when you install an MDM profile on it. So if that device gets lost, the employer can say, well, I'm going to wipe everything. That's not a great thing. So that's what becomes possible when you install an MDM profile. And I'm probably not alone in this world. There are many other people like that in the world. Another reason why that sort of prevents organizations from fully realizing BYOD's potential is regulations. So if you look at in Europe, GDPR is a big thing, and it's sort of put a pause, a bit of a slowdown on deployment of MDM profiles to personal devices because organizations don't really know the impact of those regulations and what it means for them. And so what that means when they're not deploying those MDM profiles is that those organizations are not realizing all the productivity and cost-saving benefits that they could get from users using their personal devices. And then there are also some technical limitations with MDM profiles. So for example, if somebody works for multiple organizations, think a consultant, a contractor, a board member, and even if that person is willing to have an MDM profile installed on his or her personal device, which one will it be? It's only going to be one profile that can be installed. And so solving for this problem for secure access from BYOD is something that has to be addressed. It's growing about 16% a year through 2023. So organizations that don't actively solve for this and sort of limit it to only corporate issued devices aren't realizing that full potential. And that's where something like mobile application management comes in. It's a way to ensure that security travels with the mobile app, regardless of the management status of the device. And by that I mean whether or not the device has an MDM profile on it. So let's do a quick poll question if we can.
All right, so our first poll question, turn your attention to the right-hand side of the screen and we'll see if we can get the poll up. Moment, please.
Yeah, give us a second. Well, it looks like we are running into some technical difficulty, so I think perhaps we will just skip the poll and maybe go on to the next slide. Let's do that in the interest of keeping things moving along. So, Rich, let me hand that into you to talk about unified endpoint management in Intune.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nikfar and team. So when we kind of talk about the landscape of mobility in the past, it was really limited to a subset of vendors that have been in the space for some time. And when we talked about kind of MDM management, it was primarily around iOS and Android. Microsoft's kind of stepped into the broader UEM space with a handful of other vendors that really are starting to offer cross-platform support. And really, this is now being branded Unified Endpoint Management. From Microsoft's perspective, that portfolio is really all focused in on being managed under the umbrella of Intune, with even some announcements around products like MEM now, which will kind of unify that experience even further across even other server platforms and workloads. But this really allows us to manage devices that fall into a handful of different scenarios. One of those would be company managed devices. This doesn't always mean company owned devices, but company managed would be a device that may have specifically content on it that pertains to the enterprise that's being delivered to the end user. Employee managed could be, again, completely owned, but in this case, we want to have kind of that lightest touched experience, but still to be able to manage corporate data. One of the things we'll talk about in a bit here is what Microsoft did when they introduced the concept of Intune App Protection, or MAM, Mobile Application Management, as many may know it by. And that this really doesn't rely on MDM enrollment. It's a really big advantage for scenarios like Nick Farr mentioned, interacting with other MDMs or light or zero enrollment type scenarios, and really delegating that to the application level layer. He also mentioned some other scenarios, such as third-party managed. Again, Intune App Protection, MAM, we really come into place in scenarios where maybe you're a contractor for another organization, or you have a subset of contractors that may have devices managed by their corporation, but they're still going to potentially have enterprise content in it from yours. We still need to have the same level of control over those that we do in somewhat of historically an MDM type fashion. And we do break these functionally into two different areas, which are important to understand. Just back one slide really quick, please. So again, just to kind of split out what the difference between mobile device management and application protection is MDM does require a profile to be issued on the device. As Nick already highlighted, it is one and only one profile on the device, so you can't mix and match those together. The other option, and again, with MDM, we have the ability of doing things like pushing Wi-Fi profiles and certificates and applications, and really doing kind of the full-fledged management of the device with really, fairly not limited as far as what we can do. In an application protection scenario, we really limit our protection to apps that fall under the guise of our protection umbrella. In many cases, these may be first-party apps, they may be third-party apps, they may be enterprise apps. And many organizations choose to deploy this in three different models. One could either be an MDM only device, one could be kind of that lighter touch Intune app protection scenario, or many enterprises even choose to do both, where they may even choose to MDM enroll devices for compliance reasons, but also layer in things like Intune app protection to help secure the data. One of the things that folks often mistake is what is a corporate device? Well, a corporate device is only really truly corporate solely if you don't add personal content to it. The minute you allow users to add a personal email or a personal Dropbox, that really does become a mixed mode device. So it does treat differently how you need to handle the management of those devices. Slide. So when we talk about these, again, just to dig in a little bit deeper, we have really three major device management states. One is kind of that unmanaged realm. Again, in this case, it's not going to be enrolled in any MDM, aka there's not going to be any MDM profile. We have the ability of defining and setting approved applications. In Microsoft's realm, we can enforce things like the use of the Outlook mobile application, but not native email, because we have further Intune app protection controls on that than we do in the native, and could we even have on the native. Also, we look at other apps, commonly like the mobile office suite and many others as well that are out there. And again, just like I stated earlier, the primary use case for this in protecting any data is kind of that light touch Intune app protection model. In the middle, we have our managed device. Now, again, this doesn't always mean it's a corporate owned, but anywhere where we would have corporate and personal content on would fall into this as well, where we may want to MDM manage device. And primary reasons why we want to manage devices typically are looking at various compliance states of the device, deeper than some of the pieces that Intune app protection can do. We can also deliver things like Wi-Fi and VPN profiles, and even a subset of security policies around MDM, and again, including many others that aren't listed here as well. We also have one other step, which is what's called a supervised device. This is really giving the enterprise the ability of doing everything possible you can from an iOS or now an Android perspective. If you're an iOS user, especially an iOS admin, you may be familiar with DEP. So in setting up supervised profiles, you kind of get that level above the Apple ID. In the Android realm as well, there are now devices that fall into corporate-owned scenarios that also fall into kind of this fully managed now device model that historically was only iOS. And not only do these three apply in the Microsoft realm to just iOS and Android, but also into macOS and Windows scenarios as well. Next slide. So what is our path to a managed application? How do we manage them, and what's available today? So broadly, out in the wild today, Microsoft has had a concerted effort for the better part of, 5 or 6 years now, to make sure that they're publicly delivered, meaning from the iOS and Android app stores, Office apps and other core Microsoft applications are already protected out of the gate with Intune app protection. In different scenarios, this means I may be able to do things, say, or stop things in Outlook mobile, for instance, from copying, pasting to a personal email account, or screenshotting, or be able to copy text out, or programmatically access content, or even address an additional PIN because there's corporate data where maybe the user doesn't enforce one at the device level. These are all common use cases that historically our customers have deployed either, again, in the light touch Intune app protection only model, maybe with Intune MDM, or also even with other MDMs as well, where maybe there's a third-party MDM managing the device, but they really want the users to be leveraging the Office mobile suite just due to the user experience. In addition to the Office mobile apps, there have also historically been a handful of viewer applications as well. Managed browser, now really Edge mobile, also a variety of PDF viewers, including some third-party ones as well that have been pre-wrapped. So an example, this would be like the Adobe Reader mobile application, and then different AV players and image viewers, just to ensure that we can open up secured content with mobile devices. From a Microsoft realm, there were really two ways primarily in order to manage these applications. Now, again, Microsoft, historically, they've handled the wrapping of their apps because they own those applications, the code signing certs, etc. But what happened if you wanted to bring your own? If you wanted to bring your own enterprise applications that either you developed or had an outside developer work on, your options were really limited to two items. One being the Intune app wrapping tool, which you can really make any mobile application manageable. And it's kind of a basic core wrap of the application. And again, I would say that, historically people were comfortable with this. This is the one that's been around for the most time, but also somewhat limited in what you could do. The Intune App SDK really became a lot of the core preference, where developers at the time of app development can actually integrate the Intune App SDK, so that's at the core of the application moving forward. And the Blue Cedar team here will talk a little bit more about kind of their experience and exactly where this falls in their integrations as well.
Perfect. So that's a good segue into so what Rich said with like building in custom apps, building Intune into custom apps that basically extends your app ecosystem so you can do some very interesting, perhaps even complicated workflows on your mobile devices. But the process of manually integrating can be super expensive. So for example, in this scenario, and this is what I would see as sort of a typical organization, is the apps will need to be secure because they're touching all the sensitive corporate data, but as I mentioned, manually integrating those SDKs is necessarily cheap. So a typical organization that may be starting out with app security for their custom apps would say start out with maybe 5 apps. That's not unreasonable, and that's 5 apps on iOS and Android. So that effectively translates into 10 app binaries. So in talking with our customers, we've heard that it takes typically for the first time they're integrating in an SDK, the Intune SDK into an app, it takes 1 FTE, full-time employee, about 6 weeks to do the initial integration of the app security SDK. So that's involved, that's, figuring it out, like, getting familiar with the SDK, and then also figuring it out in the app, what APIs need to be replaced, what native APIs you need to replace with the Intune APIs. And then, of course, any subsequent integration on that app will take about 2 weeks. And of course, subsequent integrations are needed anytime, for example, there's a change to the app code, you need to do the reintegration. If there's a change to the Intune SDKs, that happens at least once a year, maybe more often, to the underlying operating system. As you know, Android and iOS, they do major updates once a year, etc. You'll need to do that reintegration. So, and every time you do the integration, it costs money. So it takes developer time, which is what you're paying. And so I did some quick research, and depending on where your developers live. So if that's somewhere in Asia, you can hire somebody for maybe about $25 an hour. Whereas if you go to North America, it's about $150 an hour. The annual first-year cost, that is, includes the initial integration and then the ongoing, 5 updates per app per year, can range anywhere from 160 to 735K. So that's, a good chunk of money for 5 apps. And these costs scale linearly. So if you have 10 apps, multiply that number by 2. If you have 20 more, you just keep scaling it. And 5 apps is typically the starting point for organizations that are getting familiar, getting onto the mobility path. We've worked with organizations that want to secure 30, 60, 90 or more apps. And just imagine what that cost is going to be just for doing the manual integration, which is where automation comes in. Now, automation is already being used in many parts of the app development lifecycle. Gartner has this term, Rapid Mobile Application Development, RMAD, which is a strange acronym, but it provides low and even no-code tools to build mobile applications in all the different parts, whether it's a UI, forms, etc. And it's a future mobile development. Gartner analyst Jason Wong has estimated by 2020, 70% of enterprise mobile apps will be developed without IT involvement. And this is important because typically what has happened is when lines of businesses have wanted apps developed, they've gone to IT. And as we typically know, IT is typically stretched thin. They've got to do many things so that priority falls below. So when automation is brought into the mobile app lifecycle process, lines of business can effectively go forth and develop apps without IT's help. Now, that's great. That allows the apps to be developed faster, but that's also not so great because the drivers for lines of business, security is not a big driver. It's about getting the app over there. But not having security can prevent that rollout. So integrating security is not a skill that everybody has. So even though like Microsoft has the Intune SDK, somebody has to get familiar with the concept of security, getting familiar with that app SDK to figure out where to use the APIs to make sure that when data is being written to flash disk, to the network, etc., that the appropriate API calls are being used to secure that data. And that's where somebody like Cedar comes in. It's a cloud platform that provides automation. All that a company, so anybody, a citizen developer or somebody who works in a line of developer would need to do is upload the unsigned app binary. As you know, all mobile apps have some kind of signature on it. So you upload an app binary, whether it's iOS or Android, up to the Cedar platform, click a button to integrate the Microsoft Intune into that app. And we also end up integrating ADAL because you need that for the authentication. And out comes this app that a Microsoft Intune enabled app that can be managed just like any other Microsoft Intune app that is managed from the Azure Cloud Platform. And it's really that simple. Upload and click. And so with Cedar, what organizations end up doing, they save on development costs, number one. And very importantly, they also get the apps to users faster. So that means instead of waiting 6 weeks or 5 weeks or however long, click a button, get that app deployed, and people can start using it and being productive. And an organization doesn't have to look for a skilled cybersecurity developer. Okay, next slide, please. Sorry about that. So, though we make that process appear incredibly easy, it's one click, there's actually a lot of complicated stuff going on under the hood because, as you can imagine, integrating an app security SDK isn't as simple as just pulling in a library into the code. When the app is uploaded into the Cedar platform, what our platform does is effectively take that app apart, and we get visibility into all the function calls all the way from the app to the network layer. And because we can see what's happening, what native calls are being used to write data to disk, to the network, etc., we can intercept all these different APIs and then effectively replace those with the equivalent ones that are in the Intune SDK. We do a bunch of different techniques. So in addition to static changes, which is what happens when you go through and replace the code, replace the equivalent APIs, we also do a lot of changes that come into play at runtime, because you don't always know what functions are going to be called. Whatever we do, suffice to say, because of the depth of visibility and the techniques that we use, we ensure reliable integration of the app security SDKs. And that's super important, because that ensures that when somebody goes through and clicks that button to integrate the Intune app SDKs into that app, that data, in whichever form, when it's being written to disk or to network or whatever shared between apps, it's always secured with the Intune APIs. And again, because of the depth of visibility, we don't constrain developers. So we don't force developers to only develop in certain frameworks or use only certain IDEs or to use only certain databases in which they can store data. Because we don't provide them with constraints, developers can develop the apps in whatever framework that they are familiar with, whatever the reasons they choose it for, because there's more developers available, they're more performant, etc. Because we have that depth of interception, we can trap the relevant function calls and use the appropriate ones in the Intune SDKs. And this is something that we've done extensive testing on. Integrating the Intune app SDKs have been validated across a range of ISV and custom apps. We've tested across the 150 or so that we've seen very recently. It's a number that continues to grow as we get more and more customers using our platform. And this is an ongoing process, and we want to make sure that it's still always stays effective. Now, there's a particular use case that's very interesting for Microsoft Intune customers. So in addition to the no-code integration of the Microsoft Intune SDKs and, of course, the Azure the authentication libraries, Cedar can also embed in an in-app VPN. An in-app VPN allows the app to connect through an IKE v2 gateway to access protected resources behind the enterprise firewall. And this is typically, the resources could be anywhere, but it's generally on premises. So this embedding the in-app VPN into the mobile app is done without coding. So similar, it's one click, you can select the in-app VPN along with the Microsoft Intune SDKs. And it's an important feature because what this allows users on unenrolled devices, that means devices that don't necessarily have an MDM profile, to access these protected resources. This is great because what this allows the enterprise to do is to retain control over the data in the app, because that data that's being served up from the protected resource, which is on the right-hand side of the slide, up into the app that's on the device, is always under the control of the enterprise. And at the same time, the user's privacy isn't compromised. So if that user has his or her photos on the app or has other personal information, the enterprise has no visibility into this. This is an important feature for a Microsoft customer, this being the in-app VPN, because it provides a convenient way for them to allow users to access these protected resources using infrastructure that the customer is already likely to have, like a VPN, or something that they can very easily procure. So, with automation, so in addition to the cost and time saving, automating the process of integrating security provides some very notable benefits. So number one, which I think is a super important one, it helps organizations avoid vendor lock-in. So it gives that enterprise greater flexibility to easily switch to another UEM platform. Say if they're using a UEM platform A, B, or C, and they say, well, I want to move into to Microsoft Intune, then it's as simple as uploading that app, clicking it, and bringing it into Microsoft Intune. So there's many reasons for doing this. So, for example, a company may have started out with some other UEM vendors, and as they move along the mobility path, they may realize that UEM vendor no longer meets their needs. It can't provide the ability to work with maybe the entire Office suite, etc. And moving to another UEM is actually not a trivial undertaking. So there's significant costs for transitioning both the devices that are under MDM controls. You have to move, have to end up deploying all the MDM profiles, etc. But then, given the fact that an organization wants to take advantage of the entire BYOD user base, which may not have these MDM profiles, there's a big cost of porting those apps. So the apps may have been built with the other UEM vendors' SDKs, and now how do you move it onto, for example, Microsoft Intune? So the automation process basically allows that app-level security to be integrated into those mobile apps with, once again, a click of a button. Super easy. Another one is eliminating SDK development constraints. So, for example, if an IT says, hey, you have to use this certain app security SDK, maybe it's Microsoft Intune, which doesn't necessarily support all the frameworks in which apps can be developed. What can a developer do? You don't want to constrain developers because they are comfortable using that framework. It's like a language that they're very comfortable with. Forcing them to use another framework or another language may impact how creative they can be with an app. Automating that security would eliminate the developer constraints imposed by the app security SDKs, because what automation does is effectively provide a translation layer between what the mobile app is developed in and the app SDK. So if there's a particular set of frameworks or network protocol or UI that is not supported with the app SDK that is being integrated in the app, the automation process does that, and I'm going to say this in air quotes, does the translation of mapping all the APIs to each other so that out, once again, split comes this integrated app. And then, of course, the last bit is the ability to embed an in-app VPN into the mobile app being secure. That addresses the problem of secure connectivity from unmanaged devices. And that's a really important piece, because it's not just about making sure that the app on the device, that the data in the app on the device is secure. That's a super important part, which is where Intune comes in. But oftentimes, there is a tremendous amount of data locked away in resources behind the firewall, and you want to enable that data to be used by users. So with an in-app VPN, users no longer have to perform a separate action to basically establish a VPN session with their device before accessing protected application resources. So what they have to do when an in-app VPN is embedded in the device, into the app, they click the app, they launch it, and everything else is invisible. So that translates into a better user experience that then translates into more app usage, which then translates into a better return on mobile apps. So Rich, turning it over to you.
Yeah, so kind of digging a little bit further into app protection, now that we have a good foundation of kind of what core MDM and app protection are, there's two kind of key areas here that we focus in on and what Intune app protection offers. What we see in a lot of cases, especially in the Microsoft app portfolio, is the concept you see here of essentially multiple identity support. It means that I can have an app like Outlook or Word or Excel and have the ability to having a corporate and a personal identity, but being sure that I can segment the data between the two. Historically, this has been somewhat problematic with other third-party MDMs, mostly because that means I either had to um, have all that data accessible in the same application, or have a boundary and have a dual application experience, and that wasn't ideal for a variety of reasons. In many cases, when we implement Intune app protection, it does allow us to implement additional security controls. Similar to what Nick Farr was saying here, is it allows us to implement application encryption at rest. It allows us to enforce additional PIN or credentials controls. This is especially good for apps that may be of higher sensitivity. You may choose not to do this or exclude this if the device already has a PIN or has fingerprint unlock, etc. But you may choose for a specific type of person or role to implement an additional credential or PIN. Maybe they have access to more secure HR information or some sensitive dashboards in their applications. But some of these apps specifically may contain additional things that we want to protect outside of just kind of the core device level protection. In addition, we've already kind of talked about this at the core, but one of the most common realms of data loss on a mobile device is simple copy paste screenshot. So being able to secure what can move out of these protected to non-protected applications. And just to highlight, that means I can still move data between a protected app to a protected app just fine. Say in the case that you see on the screen here between, say, Word and Excel, but not out to, say, an unprotected application, which could be a third-party cloud storage provider, could be a social media application, etc. This also allows us to initiate application level selective wipes. So, as Nick Farr kind of pointed out earlier, one of the downfalls that organizations have typically fallen upon, especially with BYO, is that with kind of standard controls in Exchange Active Sync, aka Office 365 or Exchange on-prem, issuing a device wipe was just that. It was a wipe of the entire device. That doesn't really do well for folks that want to retain pictures of their kids or content that was personally stored on the device, even when it was allowed, and can cause some employee disruption. In addition, we can also provide a secure web browsing experience. Microsoft recently has kind of made a significant shift over into the Edge mobile platform to do this. So now this means that if our internal applications, which are protected by a variety of solutions, like we'll talk about in a minute, we can seamlessly single sign on to those applications. We can seamlessly deliver an experience for them to consume that information if there isn't a true application out there for it as well. And then certainly securely viewing unstructured data types, PDFs, images, videos, etc. Next slide. This is a bit similar. This is just highlighting a bit more from the identity perspective, so personal to corporate, just the segmentation we can offer between different applications. Again, a bit broader here and just showcasing some of the app portfolio. And again, the goal is I can kind of create that segment or that layer of protection between the different types of applications. Slide. Another important factor is around integration with Microsoft's solution called conditional access. And this is important to talk to when we talk about securing data. It is not only securing what can happen on the device, but also what happens if that device becomes compromised, and how do we determine, what the device's experience should be in the event that something like that did happen. Anytime we look to do a rollout of Intune, we typically pair this with conditional access, primarily because it gives us some additional controls. I like to term this as an enterprise identity, if this then that platform. It allows us to define down to the app level, the OS platform level, iOS, Android, Mac OS, Windows, even down to per IP, per country, is our conditions of control. So I can create some extremely granular permissions around access rights. So I can say if an HR admin is accessing a Workday application on a mobile device that's jailbroken, we can block that access until that device until that device is compliant. So it allows us to leverage a lot of these controls. And ultimately, when we talk about this, Intune app protection and other applications and services can leverage conditional access as that control mechanism, primarily identified through identity, but just as important, looking at the state of the device compliance within Intune. This allows us to initiate other policy controls, such as allowing or blocking their access. We can even step up their authentication or require they accept a term of use. And we can also even do things like on a non-corporate asset, we can limit what they can do with an application. So maybe they're on an untrusted device, an untrusted iPad. Maybe they can access Salesforce, but they can't download any content, or they can download it, but it's then protected by information protection. Again, really these two go hand in hand anytime we talk about doing Intune MDM and app protection deployments, just due to that really deep integration. Slide. And finally here, we just kind of talk about the overall platform play that Microsoft has brought to the table. When we start talking about combining some of these technologies, like I just mentioned, we really look at identity being the foundation. So things like conditional access are part of their identity and access management platform. Intune from kind of a core EPP UEM space, again, managing, today we're talking about mostly iOS and Android, but obviously also Mac OS, Windows becoming a really hot topic across a lot of our customer base. And then integrating things like information protection to ensure that our actual content itself is protected, even in addition to the measures we've already talked about. And then leveraging things like cloud-based UEBA, user and entity behavior analytics, to help determine potentially risky types of access. This really all fits into the broader platform of enterprise mobility and security, which we find a lot of our customers leverage or have, but don't leverage enough. They may own it through a variety of licensing rights, but maybe only bought it to deploy one piece, when all these really pieces have a really great integration story across some of the things that I've already talked through today. Far over to you.
So just sort of wrapping it up. So one of the big benefits with no coding with Blue Cedar in the context of enabling Microsoft Intune apps is one, starting out with the no-code integration of that in-app VPN. So it makes it super easy for Microsoft Intune enabled apps on unenrolled devices to access those corporate resources. And again, no coding required to do that. There is no code integration of the full Azure ADL, which I think is supported with the Microsoft App Wrapping tool. So you get the full identity protections with that. You can integrate regardless of the app development platform used to build that app. So again, there's no constraints on the app developers who can then focus on being creative, thinking of how to innovate on the apps, whereas Blue Cedar can focus on reliably integrating Microsoft Intune into those apps so the data is always protected. And of course, it's a point-and-click browser. Anybody can use this. And as I mentioned, it's an automated and reliable process. So we'll wrap it up. So I think before we get to the Q&A section, at the end of the webinar, we'll be sending you an email with access to 2 interesting resources. One is breaking the last barriers to Microsoft Intune integration, and then a piece from Netrix on automated integration on Microsoft Intune. If you'd like to learn more about how Netrix and Blue Cedar can best help you, I would suggest that you email info@netrixllc.com. That's the email up on the site. And of course, we'll be following up with emails with both these 2 assets that I mentioned and a recording. So at this point, I'd like to open this up for any questions that we may have. Alicia, anything came in? So let me just...
Thanks, Nikfar and Rich. Yeah, we do have some questions, so let me pull those really quick. All right, our first question, is Microsoft Intune protection different on enrolled and unenrolled devices?
I will gladly take. Yep, I'll gladly take that one. So Intune app protection can apply in the same means and manner, whether it is an unenrolled or enrolled device. So the only difference there is that you're pairing both together in one. If you choose to do MDM plus the other or not. The one thing to be aware of is an Intune app protection policy can only apply to a per user. The way that actually works on the back end, we didn't dig into much today, is all based on the user's identity. So when a user goes and launches an Intune app protection protected application, that identity is leveraged to check policy against the tenant, and then it enforces that on the device. So even if you have, say, an MDM enrolled device, you can still have apps Intune app protected independently with it, or like I said, completely by itself as well. So the way you deploy those policies are the same regardless of MDM or non-MDM, just really about how you scope those policies down. You can also, these days, there is a setting within Intune app protection where you can apply, say, those to users' devices that are only not under management. That way you can truly have, if you wanted to, a silo of MDM only and a silo of Intune app protection only, whereas prior, about 6 months plus or so ago, it was just targeted the user only. So there's a delineation now that was added recently between those 2 as well.
Great, thanks, Rich. Next question, how does Blue Cedar's platform differ from Microsoft's app wrapping tool?
Yeah, so now that I'm unmuted, no technical challenges. So let me take a stab at answering this one. We sort of covered this on this slide over here. So the big bet, here's a good summary of how it's different. So at a high level, the Blue Cedar solution is for integrating any app, not just the internal apps that are very simple, etc. So we can take, because we do the full integration of the full Azure ADL, so it can be apps that can be deployed anywhere. We do the no-code integration of the in-app VPN, which is something that that Microsoft App Wrapping tool doesn't offer. The in-app VPN is our piece. We allow integration regardless of the app development platform. So again, we effectively provide that translation layer. So whatever framework you're developing in, whether the app is developed in Cordova, React Native, etc., we can integrate that for iOS and Android. It's a point-and-click browser-based UI, whereas the app wrapping tool is Microsoft App Wrapping tool, as far as I know right now, is a bunch of scripts, which can be challenging for perhaps somebody who's working in the line of business, a citizen developer, whereas ours is a browser-based UI. And then, of course, it's very reliable because it goes through and does all these things.
Thanks, Nikfar. One more question just came through. How can I enable secure access from my mobile apps to internal resources?
So that'd be a similar one for us. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we do that embedding of the in-app VPN into mobile apps. So once you do the once you embed that into the app, regardless of whether that app is under MDM control or not, once in IKE v2 VPN is set up on the back end through the firewall, that app can connect through that and access those protected resources.
Sounds like there may have been some problems on that one. Understanding that question was, how can I enable secure access for my mobile apps to internal resources? Thanks, Nikvar. One more question. Can Cedar be used to secure Xamarin apps?
Yes, definitely. So again, because Blue Cedar has visibility down to the network layer, we can intercept those function API calls on iOS and Android, regardless of the framework that the app is developed in. So Xamarin would be one of the frameworks people develop, and we can secure those, integrate the Intune app SDKs into it.
All right, are there any more questions? If so, go ahead and send me a chat really quick. All right, looks like that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of the audience, I'd like to just go ahead and thank our expert presenters for their time and insights. At this time, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day to spend this time with us. You may now go ahead and disconnect.